We have our own Lucinda Platt for the last seminar of the term. I want to say thank you for everyone for participating in this seminar series. It was fantastic to be with everyone, like every week. It was the best time of the day, and we are closing with one of the best talks, I hope, of the term as well. I don't think that Lucinda needs an introduction, but we do have a number of people who are guests with their guests. So I just want to say that Lucinda Platt is a professor of social policy and sociology and currently head of our department. And she has worked a lot on various topics, including ethnic differences and migration and child poverty and so on, and then group differences in inequality. And she is the member of the prestigious Deaton Review as well currently. And there are so many things that I could actually say about Lucinda. I just give the floor to her directly and then hear what she says about the immigrant labor market assimilation in Europe. Thank you, Lucinda. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for those very kind words. So I'm going to share my screen. Should, yes, oops, get to the top. So I hope you can all see that now. So it's very nice to be here and to be able to talk about this work, which has been a very long time in gestation, I might say. So thinking about which integration policies work and the heterogeneous impact of national institutions on immigrants' labour market attainment in Europe. And this is joint work with Javier Polavieja and with Jonas Radel. And Jonas is here today, which is really nice. And so he can also jump in the questions as needed as well. Or correct me if he doesn't like what I'm saying. So yes, so we've been working on this quite for a while, but I think we're getting to a place where we're quite happy with it. So the question that we were trying to address is sort of a fairly fundamental question: do policies intended to aid the integration of immigrants actually make a difference to the labour market success, and also whether other institutional factors matter? So kind of it sounds like quite a basic question. So where does it come from? Well, there's clear evidence for variation in labour market outcomes of immigrants across countries. So they seem to do better in some countries than others. This is partly driven by the fact that migrants with different skills, different characteristics migrate to different places. But even net of those observable migrant characteristics, we still see these differences in labour market success, if you like. So it looks like there should be a role for policy, at least in this. There have been a number of studies which have used the MIPEX, the Migrant Policy Index, Integration Index, which is the bringing together of policies that relate to migrant integration from a large number of countries and putting them and sort of organising them into different dimensions and putting them into an index, and there you can look it up. And so a number of studies have said, well, if it's policy that matters, then it should show up if you put the MIPEX into your regression, and then you should see that that's explaining differences in labour market outcomes for immigrants in different contexts, in different country contexts. The trouble is, when you do that, in most of the literature that does that, it shows nothing, basically, or almost nothing. So this is a little bit of a puzzle. Does that really mean that policies don't matter? There's also literature which has shown that other factors, other sort of institutional factors like labour market flexibility is relevant for immigrants' outcomes. For example, Colgan in a 2006 paper made the argument that migrants will fare better, they'll have better employment outcomes in more flexible labour markets. And she seemed to show that, but there's been other papers which have not produced quite the same finding. And it's also the case that studies which look at some of these factors, these policy and institutional factors, don't necessarily also adjust for other ways that countries might differ and that might be relevant, like, for example, the shares of workers in sort of low skilled, the share of the labour market that is low skilled, where you think that might be particularly open to migrant workers and promote their employment, even if not their occupational success. So there may be some reasons why we're not seeing some sort of consistent results. There are a number of studies also, there are a number of studies which try to take all the factors together that sort of summarise a country in terms of looking at differences across regimes. So these can shed light on sort of constellations of institutional factors, but don't tell us about particular policies. And so if we want to know whether particular policies matter, whether policies work or are effective, then we can't sort of extrapolate it from these studies, even if they show that there are clear differences in the ways that migrants fare in different welfare regime contexts. On the other hand, we think the work that does try to look at institutional factors or policies or draw out these individual features, it's got some further limitations, in that it tends to focus on access to employment. We think that actually, if you're thinking about whether immigrants are prospering or not, you want to look at kind of their occupational success rather than simply whether they're in employment in the first place or not. And we also think, as I'll go on to say, that the factors that are associated with occupational success may be, we may better capture factors that are associated with occupational success through policies than we may for employment, where you could imagine that the employment may be not particularly good, but migrants may still enter it, or employment may be good and migrants may enter it, and so you wouldn't necessarily expect to be able to then discern policy differences. The other issue is that in some of this work, when looking at policies, often the overall index, the overall MIPEX index, has been used rather than breaking it down into its component elements. And again, just for the reasons of disentangling what the policies are, it's more informative to look at component elements, but also it may be that you're getting sort of different influences compounding each other, or even that some aren't even relevant to the outcomes you're looking at, and you're putting them all in this kind of black box of a single index. So we try and improve on this. So we argue that certainly some integration policies may matter more for occupational success rather than access to employment. You can think here in particular about things like anti-discrimination legislation. There's ongoing work that shows that discrimination persists in labour market access, and it's relatively straightforward to discriminate in terms of not allowing someone access to a job, even when there's anti-discrimination legislation, partly because often the processes aren't even necessarily conscious. Once somebody's in work, you may think, well, okay, the level of work they achieve or the level of occupational success they achieve, then that may be more sensitive to anti-discrimination legislation, because the costs kind of behaving badly are much more, for employers, they become much more visible, and therefore they incur these costs. The other area I've looked at, I mentioned that it's been argued that more flexible labour markets are more conducive to migrants' employment. That's been one argument, but that there have been inconsistent results. Well, we also think that employment regulation may be more relevant for occupational outcomes rather than employment access. So this relates to the issue of, if you're going to get that it may not matter for getting a job in the first place whether labour markets are more or less flexible, but it may be very important for what sort of job you get, whether you're in kind of a more rigid labour market, whether you're in an inside or outside a labour market, and so on. So we think some of the models, in a sense, may be misspecified in that they're not using the right outcome, and they're not necessarily breaking down the policies in the right way to be able to identify that. And the other issue is if you do combine everything in the MyPEX indicators, as I said, not all the factors are necessarily relevant for immigrants' outcomes specifically. We can think about it includes educational policies for sort of school children to the extent to which they favour migrant or second generation outcomes. That's not going to be very relevant when you're looking at whether immigrants are in a job or in a good job or not. We also think that policies may also be more and less relevant for those with different characteristics, in particular factors such as the level of education. So some policies may be more relevant for skilled workers, some may be more relevant for higher skilled workers. And I'll come back and say a little bit more about that when I talk about what we're measuring specifically. So we attempt to look at the influence of policies on occupational outcomes measured using the International Socioeconomic Index. But unlike some other studies that have looked at occupation, we account for selection into employment, because it's clearly going to matter how far those in an occupation are selected or not. So where there's less participation in employment, overall, you'd expect the workers to be more selected, and therefore you'd expect them to do better. So it's important to consider selection into employment across these different contexts. And we aim to identify specific policy areas and institutional characteristics that can theoretically be linked to this occupational attainment. For the purposes of because we're looking at selection, so we're looking at access to employment and conditional on that occupation. We also think about some policies that may be specifically relevant for access to employment. And in this, we can therefore test, for example, the welfare magnet assumption, which has been discussed, which suggests that more generous welfare states are not good for or it kind of promote poorer employment outcomes for migrants. And we do consider whether there are heterogeneous policy effects. So specifically, we look at men and women separately, because when men and women have different occupational distributions, so we wouldn't expect any policies necessarily to work in the same way. They're relating to different occupations, different labour market patterns. We distinguish whether there are heterogeneous effects for higher versus low skilled. So we might expect, for example, that the higher skilled would benefit more from anti-discrimination legislation, because if they're higher skilled, there's more chance of going up. And therefore, if there's anti-discrimination legislation that isn't holding them back, then they may be able to prosper more, whereas low skilled may be consigned to occupations with more of a ceiling. And so the anti-discrimination legislation will simply be less relevant. And we look at whether there's heterogeneous policy effects for Muslims versus non-Muslims. And this is because there's quite a lot of literature and evidence on sort of the ideas of cultural threat in relation to the labour market, and evidence that labour market discrimination and exclusion is greater for Muslims than not. So on the one hand, we may expect policies to be more relevant, particularly such as anti-discrimination legislation. On the other hand, we may expect policies to be less relevant because of this sense that there's a very sort of fundamental exclusionary process. And we make various evolved theoretical arguments relating to these, relating to our approach, which you can come back to if you like, but I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to dwell on in this presentation. So let's say a little bit more about what we actually do. So we use the European Social Survey, and we use the first 6 rounds from 2002 to 2012, 72 years. And our sample is a sample of nearly 3,000 men and somewhat over 3,000 women. And these are all foreign-born. They're foreign-born who come from countries that are outside the EU or the EEA. This is because, again, if you mix those who migrate under different conditions of free movement, you're probably going to confound policy effects, because policies apply differently to those who are from the EU to those who are from third countries, and so you won't be able to necessarily be able to reveal these policy impacts. So we concentrate only on these third country nationals, if you like. We concentrate on those of working age, and they had to have arrived in the destination country above the age of 13. In our sample, they come from 132 different country origins, including high, low and middle income countries. And they are living in the 23 European countries which we study. So we use the ESS data for these 23 countries. And we pull these rounds. Not all countries participate in all rounds, but all our 23 countries participated in some rounds of the ESS, and some countries participate in every round. So I mentioned we use the ISEI as our main dependent variable, which is a continuous measure of occupational status that has a range from around 19 to around 90. I think 90 is judges. So higher is higher score is higher occupational status, and these are occupations that yield higher labour market returns. So that's how it's constructed to measure. And we want to see the influence of policies and institutional factors on this. So in terms of sort of integration policies, drawing on sort of separating out different domains of the MIPEX, we look at anti-discrimination legislation. As I've already mentioned, we expect that to be more relevant for occupational outcomes than necessary for access to employment. We look at the extent to which it's possible to convert credentials. And this is, again, another area where we expect this to be more relevant for occupational outcomes, to favour those more, and potentially also to be more relevant for higher skilled relative to lower skilled immigrants. We look at the extent to which immigrants enjoy more or less equal labour market rights with native populations. And we look at the extent to which there are job support policies, so policies which help them with, I'm trying to think of how it's best described. So access to things like educational and vocational training, to find and help with finding kind of the best match for their skills in the labour market. We also use from the MIPEX access to social security. So we're not arguing that this matters for occupational outcomes, but we do think it might be relevant for whether people can access employment or do access employment or not. And this we do as part of testing this welfare magnet hypothesis, which I'll come back to. So we look, in relation to that, we look at welfare expenditure, and we put welfare expenditure as a potential influence on whether or not immigrants are in work. So there is some existing work that suggests that countries with higher welfare expenditure, there is less participation in employment, there are lower employment rates. And this has been used to argue that migrants sort of select into countries where, if they are less inclined to be in work, they select into countries with higher welfare expenditure. The problem with this argument is that, of course, that's only going to matter if the migrants can actually access the social security, this generous social security. So it's neither here nor there if there's more or less generous welfare expenditure if they can't access it anyway. So what we think is important to do is to think, okay, does welfare expenditure itself promote or decrease employment, but does it do so when it's interacted with the access to social security, which is our measure there? So this is a sort of side element of analysis, is kind of test this welfare magnet hypothesis in the employment part of our equation. And we also look at hiring and minimum wage regulations. So this is to capture the idea of a more or less flexible labour market. And so we have measures of that, which you and I spent an awful lot of time putting together for our different country years. Additional factors of the labour market context, which I think it's important to take into account, is the size of the manual sector. So we think countries where there's a larger manual sector, which will kind of absorb more jobs, sort of the lower skilled jobs, will be more. There will be more immigrants who are looking for those sorts of jobs, and therefore there will be less sort of occupational success. And we also use regional unemployment rates within country, so the more local unemployment rates, to identify our employment equation. So the idea that employment rates will impact whether or not somebody's employed or not, but they will not impact their occupational outcomes except through employment. We also have some individual level measures from the data. So we have educational level, which we split between sort of lower and higher educated. We are testing our sort of Muslim hypothesis with whether or not affiliated to Islam. We have age. We have years of residence in the country in sort of bands, so that it's not collinear with age. We have whether the local country, the destination country, is spoken at home or not. And as a control for the sort of the origin, we have the HDI of the country of origin measured in 1990, which is kind of therefore represents a midpoint in terms of when people migrated. And we include dummies for the ESS round. So thinking about the model, reading the time. Yes, I will get into the results soon. So we estimate a Heckman selection model for maximum likelihood Heckman selection model of ICI. So accounting for selection, so with the equation with the equation for the occupational status for the ISCI, which includes all those policy and institutional measures of interest I went through. Plus, we also control for the average ICI of the country year, so that we're looking kind of at the net effects relative to the kind of native standing in the country. This is where we control for the HDI, and we control for education, age, duration of stay, Muslim or not. For the selection model, the employment selection model, we, as I mentioned, we identify it with the regional unemployment rate. And we also include these measures of social expenditure, but also the access to social security for immigrants and the interaction of these two terms with the, on the basis that it's only the interaction that will support the idea that there's a welfare magnet taking place. And then we include other individual measures as well. And we put the ESS round in the employment equation. We cluster standard errors on the country year because we're using a pooled sample. So on to some results. By the way, I should have said, if people have questions when if they go along, they should, if you could collect questions of clarification to Berkay, and he will then pass them on to me, and I will attempt to clarify. So
I already announced it on the chat function for everyone.
Okay.
No questions so far from the audience. I have one clarification question myself, so I can hold myself. So the employment, does it include self-employment?
It includes includes whether they have a job. I think it does include self-employment, because I think it's whether they're in work. Gosh, it's a while since I've looked at the variables.
I think it is paid work. I think it's
So are they in paid work? So that should include self-employment. Pretty certain it does. If I'm wrong, I'll let you know. I'll double check and let you know, but I'm pretty certain it is. So it's any form of paid work.
Sorry, Kitty has a clarification question. Is access to Social Security a dummy variable? How to capture the extent of access?
So access to Social Security is part of this MyPEX index. So they measure, so they have, so they collect information, and then they have a kind of scale. Typically it's either 0 to 3 or 1 to 3 scale, and you can be either not good or very good, depending on how that excess is evaluated. So they're translating what are fundamentally kind of quite qualitative evaluations of policy into a scale, and then you can sort of combine them all up into the total index, but we don't. We look at the broken down ones. So it's one of the particular sort of subdomains, and there's lots more information about exactly how they classify it. But it's not just a dummy, no, and it's from this evaluation of policies from the MyPEX index.
I think it's 3 levels, if I remember correct. So 0, 50, or 100, and that's the lowest level of aggregation of the MyPEX.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's all. Thank you.
Good. Great. Okay. So there's a rather lot going on here, but I wanted to try and fit it all into one slide and show it schematically, which means you don't get the size of the effects, but. Many of them are, as you'd expect. So those with lower education are less likely to have higher occupational outcomes. Those who are Muslim also strikingly lower occupational outcomes, even after adjusting for the other factors, because these are the estimates adjusting for the covariates. And this is also true, that both of these are also true for employment. Again, you'd expect it for lower education that have lower access to employment, but it's also very strikingly true for Muslim men compared to other immigrant men. If we go through the kind of the measures, there aren't very many results coming through, and there's not a very consistent pattern. What we do see, though, is that anti-discrimination legislation is positively associated with occupational success. I think Berko just muted me, but I'm not sure, or somebody did.
All right. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Sorry about it.
You've had enough, had you? There were also some sort of slightly odd findings that we can't do very much with. So job support is negatively associated with occupational success. We think this may be because, and this has been argued in another paper, that those who are kind of eligible for job support are those who are struggling more in the labour market, and therefore you get, the more job support you get, the worse your outcomes are because you're the one who needs it. So we think there's a possible explanation there.
Listen, the clarification question here.
Yes. Yeah.
So you talk in terms of association, and then you do have a Heckman selection. So what is there to make the causal claim? So what kind of selection or endogeneity problem that is left so that you use the term of association after the Heckman selection?
Because I think it would probably be slightly rash to say this is definitely causal. I would not be confident in that. That would assume we would sort of taken everything into account. But what we're interested in is kind of the taking out the selection issue, so that it's not. I mean, that's our main interest in adjusting for using the Heckman model, is that that we're able to compare across contexts with different levels of selection.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but we can maybe talk more about that if you want to come back to that. So there are things like the size of the manual sector is negatively associated very consistently, as we'd expect. And in the selection equation, so just again drawing attention to the bits in red, because I thought this was the easiest way to draw your eye. So we see that social expenditure is negatively associated with employment. And that's the same finding that we've seen in some of the other literature, which has therefore said this is the welfare magnet effect taking place. But we see that access to social security is positively associated with employment. And we see that the interaction between the two is not statistically significantly related to employment, which means that we think that there's no basis on which to say there's a welfare magnet effect, because it could only be revealed by people with access being able to take advantage of that greater generosity. So we think that the greater generosity is associated with other factors which mean that there's lower employment rather than it being evidence of a welfare magnet effect. So I think those are the main things that I want to draw out. I've been concentrating on the kind of the full model. We tested across the different measures and then put them in the one to see what kind of stood up. And then we do the same. Is it moving? No, it's not. Then we do the same for women. So again, looking at the full model, we see that this negative effect for job support again, so it's very similar to the men. But we see this positive, again, this positive effect of anti-discrimination policies on occupational success. So very, very consistent story there, it seems to matter. And again, we see this negative in the employment equation, we see the negative effect of social expenditure, but the positive effect of access and a non-significant interaction effect. We see some other statistically significant coefficients, but they move around a bit and we're not particularly confident about them, particularly given that they're not consistent across the two samples. So we sort of take away from this that we have robust results for anti-discrimination positive effect, and therefore we want to look at that more. So we want to look at whether it applies more to some people than to others. In particular, as mentioned, we think that anti-discrimination legislation may be more relevant for higher skilled, because it gives them greater chances of occupational success. And we also thought it was worth looking at whether it was interacted with Muslim, so whether it was different for Muslims, whether it helped to counteract the very strong negative effects, or whether in fact if there was this sort of felt to be this very strong bar, it was irrelevant because the if you like, the taste for discrimination overruled the costs of breaking anti-discrimination legislation. So here you've got men and women together, and here I have put the values in because it just gives you some indication of the kind of the magnitude, and it also shows, because we've got interactions in it, means you can kind of add them up and see what the net effect is. So you see for men, you've got the very strong effect of low education. You've got the very strong effect of, or fairly strong effect of being Muslim. You've got the positive effect of anti-discrimination legislation. But if you interact that with being Muslim, you show that actually that effect is only there for non-Muslims. So anti-discrimination legislation is good for non-Muslim men. It doesn't make any difference for Muslim men. And the same is true if you look at low educated. So anti-discrimination legislation is, if you look at Model 3, anti-discrimination legislation is good for higher educated, and for lower educated. If you look at the size of the interaction effect, it's almost the same. So it cancels out, so it makes no difference to lower educated. So it's only of value to the higher educated. If you look at women, you don't get these interaction effects. So anti-discrimination policies are good, seem to be good across the board, and there's no interaction with either Muslim or with lower educated. We think this may be because of the sorts of occupations that they're in, so that because they're more constrained anyway in their occupational options, that being lower educated and higher educated, I mean, there's less chance for you to benefit anyway, so there's less difference between the two. But it is still a positive effect overall of anti-discrimination legislation. And it seems to be true that it's also the case whether you are Muslim or not Muslim for women. So it seems to be Muslim men in particular, and low-educated men who don't get this benefit of policy relating to anti-discrimination. So this is my summary. I think I'm just about on time for the conclusion. So consistent with some other studies, we found little support for a number of policy effects. So we're still replicating some of that non-finding. But we thought it was interesting that we found a clear negative association between labour market rigidity and immigrants' occupational scores. And also that we found a strong positive association between anti-discrimination policies and immigrants' occupational attainment. But we also thought it was quite notable that the effect of discrimination policies was heterogeneous, that it benefited all women equally, but was limited among men to those who were higher skilled and who were not Muslim, as I just said. So I think I'll leave it there. There's more I could say, but I'd like to hear your thoughts and comments and to have a chance to discuss further.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. So I just applaud on behalf of everyone here. Thank you for a great talk. I directly turn my attention to hands, the blue hands. Actually, Zoom has updated now, like the hands are in the same shape as the applauses. So
very confusing.
Yeah, it's confusing. So anyone wants to ask, please raise the hand or wave or do something. I'll try to see everyone. Mary Alice, please.
Hi, Lucinda. That was really interesting. Thank you. I have, I think, two questions, if that's okay. One is I was interested in whether you find that the selection matters. Like, do the effect look different if you just use a regular regression without the Heckman selection model? And then the other one was, I was also curious if you've looked at whether these variables have the same effects for the native population, or if it's like specific effects for immigrants.
So, so in relation to the first question, it seems to be particularly important for women. So the results do look different for women, and the kind of the test of the independent suggests for both men and women suggests that selection is relevant, so that it's important to adjust for it, and that's true for men as well. Yeah, but clearly, because far fewer women are actually in employment, it makes a lot more of a difference for women. So we didn't. This was a study of immigrants. So these. So we haven't. No, we haven't tried the sort of counterfactual of whether policies that are intended to affect immigrants also affect natives. Was that the question? Yeah.
So
it'd be an interesting placebo test to do, actually.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
So there's Chris. Go ahead, please, and ask the question. So.
Hey, thank you. So my immediate thought was about the anti-discrimination laws, that they may be correlated in some way with sort of like the attitudes of the country. So like places that have more progressive attitudes about immigration may be more likely to implement these laws. And so I'm wondering if there could be a situation where, the places that have progressive attitudes are less likely to discriminate in employment, and it may be not necessarily the discrimination laws themselves. Does that kind of make sense as a possibility?
Yeah, I could see it as a possibility. I mean, there are other things in there that you'd expect potentially to be associated with attitudes, including the unemployment rates, including the size of the low skill sector. I'm not sure that it's a case that I haven't tried to plot against attitudes what the MyPEX things. I mean, it would be possible.
Yeah, it may not even be the case. I mean, there's lots of factors that will go into the passage of those policies, but I just thought it might be something worth considering.
Yeah. And would that affect occupation specifically rather than employment?
Well, I mean, my thought is just a place that, yeah, I mean, you're right that I don't have a theoretical reason to think it would affect one outcome over the other, but just generally speaking, there is some evidence, for instance, like I know from the United States that places with more conservative racial attitudes have bigger like wage gaps between Black and white residents, right? And so the assumption is that something going into like employer preferences or something like that might take hold. So
yeah, so it depends which way round it is, doesn't it? Because you'd also expect there to be, I mean, the sort of implementation of anti-discrimination legislation just kind of change the way people express attitudes and how they feel about the potential of expressing attitudes.
Right. There's going to be like feedback effects from the policy as well, so it's a complicated sort of thing. But it's just a thought.
Yeah, something to look into. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We have Laura and Anne. Anne, your hand was up, but not anymore. So, did you want to ask a question still?
Well, okay. I wasn't sure how relevant it was going to be, but I'll ask in any case. One of the things was, to what extent do the countries cluster together in terms of the policies that they have? So I was wondering whether what you found might relate in any way to the VOC literature. And I just thought it was worth seeing whether there's anything there on the theoretical side.
But wouldn't that be kind of taking us back to looking at clusters when we're trying to get away from?
I can see that, yes, but I think it's just to what extent are there, I think it's just worth asking that, what the relationship is. I mean, you're saying, I can see the point of getting away from that, but it might be there's something there that's overarching. So I suppose that was what I was wondering, but it might be that you've already taken account of that. So in terms of the types of countries or the characteristics of the legislation in those countries.
So that it's not about policies, it's about the whole, would that be the argument that it's?
Well, it's those countries that have particular types of policies that have, the policies that, whether there's any way of grouping the policies.
Yeah, no, I sort of see what you mean, and I'm thinking, but I'm thinking that's sort of, I mean, it would be, yeah, you could look at whether there's any similarity between them, but it's sort of the opposite to what we're trying to do.
Okay. Okay.
I guess, which is to sort of disentangle sort of policies rather than say which one go together. Particularly as this is specifically for immigrant integration. So
I was thinking of the specific countries that you have in where there's scope for looking further, I think is really what I'm getting at. What the characteristics are and what goes along with these policies or doesn't go along with these policies. So I'm sort of wondering whether there's more than just the policy, if you like, which is what you said. I'm looking for perhaps whether there's more than that and whether there's a group of different factors that might actually lead to these particular outcomes.
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
I was looking to see whether I find the descriptives. I guess that's what you would like to see, right? Some descriptives of the actual macro policy indicators by country. I can see if I can still dig them up. But
yeah, I don't think we've.
Don't worry about it. It was a bit of a left field question, but I was just rather intrigued. It's a very interesting presentation. I ended up thinking, what's going on?
Yeah.
Anyhow, that's fine. Thanks, Becca.
Thank you, Anne. Yes. Laura and Stephen, so do you want to collect both questions and answer them both? Because we might have more come in.
Okay.
Laura.
Yes, I'm not sure how relevant my question is. I was just, maybe also my ignorance, but I was just wondering, in your sample, you have, I remember, 23 countries, I think, 23 European countries. I'm wondering, is there, or have you thought about that there's probably also variation in terms of sample size between these countries? Like, how would that, or does that have any impact on the results? I'm assuming Western European countries, which also are more that have also more generous integration policies, have also larger sample sizes. So I was wondering if you have considered that, or if you think it's relevant. Thanks.
Berkay, you want me to collect before replying?
Yes, please. Yeah. Yes, please. Because there's Stephen, and then Evelina, and then Michaela. Stephen, please. You're mute.
Yeah, I had to find where to unmute. So the first part of my question was related to what Laura just said, so I won't say it. But I was just wondering about ESS response rates, whether or not there are differential response rates by immigrants within and between countries, and whether or not the ESS does anything about that, and hence potentially use of weights and so on.
Should I take those two together because they're kind of related?
Yeah.
So I think Stephen must have been our reviewer, wasn't he? Jonas. So
is that right?
You
never told
in relation to yes, yeah, so they're slightly related. Sorry?
I said you never told me you got that comment.
Sample sizes, yes. I mean, we haven't adjusted for sample size, and there is some variation in sample size, and we then thought maybe we should think about adjusting for sample size, and therefore effectively weighting. But we've had quite a lot of discussions about the kind of pros and cons of this, because if you treat every country as if you give every country the same weight, then that has different issues. So it's kind of an ongoing. It's a really good point, Laura. It's an ongoing conversation. We did try out some sort of different weighting, and my memory is that the models for men looked a bit different, not substantially different, but we couldn't get the Heckman selection models to converge for women. So we couldn't answer very clearly whether they were the, and then they did look different, because if you don't take account of selection for women, they look very different. So we weren't sure quite how much difference that would make, but it is something we think is worth looking into further. So we're talking about, and in relation to non-response, we don't know how response differs for immigrants, but we do know, and we were asked to look at what share of respondents are excluded because they don't speak the language. So the ESS doesn't translate into other countries unless there's 5% or more who speak the minority language. So for example, in Germany, I think it does translate into Turkish because there's more than 5%. So we used that information to weight and the sample. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but it gets a little way towards it. And the results didn't change. And what we also did was we thought, well, actually people's language improves over time, and the kind of and their integration improves over time, and the hardest to capture the most recent arrivals. So if we exclude all those who are recent arrivals, then we'll have a much more comparable set of observations. So we excluded, and if we excluded recent arrivals and just did it on those who've been there for 5 years or more, we got the same results. So I hope that answers your question, Stephen, even if it's sort of, I can't answer that was fully yet.
So thank you so much, Lucinda. I do want to squeeze in one question before Evelina and Michaela. Marta has asked on the chat. She says I'd like to ask if and why labor market rights were not positively correlated with occupational success, like anti-discrimination. So take down this question, then we can move on to Evelina and Michaela, and then you may answer all three. Evelina, would you like?
So why labour market rights weren't? Yeah.
I think this is a unionization thing, no? Like works councils and things like that.
I mean, we would expect that other things being equal, they would be. So it was one of those effects where there seems to be no particular role of policy. We don't have I don't think we have much of an explanation for why there's no positive effect in that case. But other than that, maybe it actually doesn't really relate to occupational success. It relates to other aspects of inclusion in the role.
All these MIBEX indicators are always measured kind of with natives as the baseline. So whether third country nationals have full rights in comparison to majority workers in the country. So yeah, you would, I guess, expect maybe a positive effect on occupational attainment, maybe not on employment, right? Because that is, it's conditional on being a worker.
In a job in the first place, yes. Yeah.
Good.
But it also may be that if it's not great for the natives, then being equal to the natives isn't going to be great either. Yeah. So there may be some issues around that, but we haven't got a very good explanation, I'm afraid, of the non-effect.
Thank you. I hope that's a good answer for Marta. I think yes. Yeah, Marta says thank you. So Evelina, it's your turn, and then Michaela.
Thank you, Borg and Lucinda. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question that kind of touches on differences between the countries, and specifically about traditional ethnic minorities and the context they provide for immigrants to integrate. On one hand, as support networks that might help newcomers find a job, but also prejudice that might have been created over time because of these groups of people being there. And I'm thinking, like, in some countries like the Netherlands, for example, there are large Muslim minorities, and in Spain there wouldn't be so many Muslims, but more people from South America, and they are also concentrated within specific jobs. So I was wondering whether you control for the context that existing ethnic minorities might provide for immigrants. Thank you.
No, we don't, except insofar as it's captured by other things we adjust for. The reception context in terms of community. But I'm not. I mean, there seem to be two bits to that. One is the sort of the role of relative concentration of own group in promoting integration, and the other seems to be the opposite thing. You're saying that it might stimulate negative responses. So I'm not sure we could disentangle that anyway. I mean, there are other things we could potentially there are other things you could include in the measures of the destination country measures, but we were focusing very much on the kind of the institutional context.
We do cite we do cite a very related study by Van Tubergen, who looks at exactly those community effects, if I understood the question correctly. So kind of interactions between origin and destination countries specifically. And so but then the way that paper, for instance, tackles the role of institutions, we found to be somewhat lackluster. So that's kind of one of the added values of this paper, where we try to be a bit more fine-grained about the mechanisms that we would expect the institutions to matter through, and then as Lucinda explained, also be a bit more elaborate about the way we distinguish between just inclusion in the labor market via paid employment and then occupational attainment, which both are relevant, but typically previous studies have looked at just one or the other.
Particularly employment, yeah. And also a lot of these, a lot of the studies like the Van Dubergen also uses cross-level, multi-level models, and we know better than to use multi-level models.
So great, thank you so much, Evelyn. Is that all right? Then, Michaela, please.
But thank you for the question. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, Lucinda. I had a question that kind of followed up on Evelyn, and my question was whether why did you choose to focus on Muslim versus non-Muslim migrant population? Because that was my line of thinking, that in some European countries, the length of time which Muslim minorities spend in that country is longer, therefore the native population, which also by the attitudes kind of feed the policy cycle that are used to them. So whether there are some other indicators you are also controlling for, which might be more triggering negative attitudes in other countries. And my second question was how if I'm not sure whether I'm ignorant here. I'm not really sure how MIPEX works, but I believe they follow how the law changes and how the so when you are pulling those 6 rounds, and if the law changes in a particular country between 2 rounds or like between different years, how does it show in your model, or whether you are able to disentangle this change of law in the country? If you can just explain how you look at it.
In answer to the first question, well, this is because there's so much literature that suggests that there is low labour market disadvantage among Muslims, and then when we put in the dummy for Muslim, I mean the effects were massive, and they were for occupation as well. So it empirically it seemed like a very salient distinction, and given that, we therefore thought it was relevant to look at whether it was affected by policy, whether there was specific policy effects. And we can, we control for length of time in the country, and so I think that was one of the things you mentioned, the duration of stay. So we're adjusting for that. So that's already there at the individual level, and we're also adjusting for things that you might think maybe is associated, like the size of the non-manual or the manual sector, whichever way you construct that. So I think the sort of the empirical results kind of justify the inclusion, because it's really striking. In terms of the MIPEX, we matched the MIPEX to the MIPEX covers various years. So we were using the 2010 version, which we could then match to our years. And yes, they do update it, and they do say which year it applies to. So it doesn't exist for every year, but you can apply it to the kind of the closest. There's some various versions, and you can apply the closest version to the years you have.
I'm not sure it was two or three.
Yeah, I think we had, yeah, exactly. So
time points. But for some of the other policy measures, we actually have yearly information. For example, the hiring and firing regulations that we had on a yearly basis, and then we did use it at that most disaggregated level.
And there was some. We looked a little bit at how much there was change, because some analyses they try and use. Particularly when they're using multi-level models, they try and use country year to maximize the number of observations, and we kind of looked at whether that was whether there was enough variation, and there was some change, but there wasn't enough change in these measures to really justify that approach. There was relative consistency, so we did look at that.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. So Johan has a question now. Johan, is that okay if I just stop recording and then we continue with asking your question, because it's almost 1 hour. and we can just say, for anyone who wants to stay here, please stay here. I'll just stop recording. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, everybody.